It's been 5 minutes. I guess we can go ahead and get started now. Um, a lot of people still haven't joined, but I guess we can just go ahead. To start, before I start teaching what we're trying to cover today, was just starting evolution and trying to get through most of it. Um, and evolution will be covered around this week, next week, and the week after or so. And then we'll move on to a different topic, but we're starting with evolution today. So if you guys haven't seen, in the class syllabus, there is a link to a Google Doc that has a lot of useful information. Also on the class syllabus is the link to the notes we use and that we cover in class. It's the first link. I highly recommend that if you can, either online or a physical copy, try and get either the Campbell Biology textbook or the Campbell Biology in Focus, which is specifically made for AP, and that's what I used in when I took AP Biology in class. But you can use either of those; they both work. Uh, so on that Google Doc that's linked on the syllabus, I can put it in the chat. There's notes for all the topics. So if you don't want to look at a PowerPoint when you're going back to review, if you are, you can just look on the notes linked here. And today the corresponding chapter should be chapter 19 through 23, ideally if we can get through everything. If not, it'll just be 19 up to where we cover. That's all I have. Also, if you are studying for the AP test, which last class it seems like none of you were, but I would I would ask you to reconsider if you are just still want to take through this class, but you don't want to take the AP test. I think it would be beneficial if you do go through this class and you end up learning the content. It's just a little bit more practice and review to do well on the AP test. I'll put the link to the Quizlet that has the vocab terms. This has the vocab terms that you need to know for the AP test, or I guess you don't specifically need to know them, but these are the useful vocab terms for the units that we're going to cover. They have chapter correspondence in the Quizlet, so you can see what chapters they correspond to. So the Quizlet and the notes that I linked are made. They're made using the Campbell Biology in Focus textbook. So those are the chapters that they're based on. In this class, we're going to be covering PowerPoints that are made from the original Campbell Biology textbook. So the chapters aren't like corresponding the same. For example, today we'll start with chapter 22, but that corresponds to 19 in the notes and stuff. But they do cover very similar content since they're both made by Campbell. 1 second. So I think we can get started with what we're covering today. Okay. So chapter 22, we're just going to start with an overview of evolution, and ideally, if we can, we're going to get into more specifics today. So of course, Darwin, he's the most important person when we're talking about evolution. He really started it all. So when you're talking about evolution, you want to know what he did, which in 1859 he published The Origin of Species, which focused biologists' attention on the great variety and diversity of organisms. That really started our look into evolution and really boosted how we think about biology today. So things Darwin noted are current species are descendants of ancestral species, and they change over time. And evolution, in a very, very brief sense, is descent with modification. That's a very quick way to define evolution, but it is accurate. So evolution has a lot of components in it, but you can view it as both a pattern and a process. So these are just ideas that were thrown around during like about how people thought that organism change and generally just ideas about biology. So Darwin, his ideas started in the mid to early 1800s and developed to the end of the 19th century. Throughout this time, there's been a lot of ideas. An important person when talking about evolution is also Lamarck, because he was wrong, but he had a right idea, which kind of helped Darwin a little bit. So Linnaeus, who's the first named on there, he was one of the earliest people. He talked about taxonomy, which is concerned with classifying organisms. Paleontology, which is concerned with fossils, was largely developed by Georges Cuvier. The study of fossils helped to lay groundwork for Darwin to really flesh out evolution because it does provide a lot of evidence. So fossils, I guess the definition is that they are remains or traces of organisms from the past, usually found in sedimentary rock, which appears in layers of rock or strata. So these are like the different layers of rock that are present or strata. So the lower down you go, the older the fossils. So that's a good way for relative dating of fossils. You can see what's older than the other. Lamarck, he hypothesized that species evolve through use and disuse of body parts and the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So a good example of this is take a giraffe. So a giraffe needs to go, it has an insanely long neck and needs to eat leaves at the top of a tree. Let's say you have a lot of giraffes and the giraffes just want to make their neck longer so they can get leaves higher up. So Lamarck thought that they were just extending their necks over time and they would pass down that extension. However, we now know that isn't true. Um, uh, we now know that isn't true. Um, yeah. So during his travels on the Beagle, Darwin traveled all over the world. He went to South America. He collected plants and animals there. He observed adaptations of plants and animals. So a key part of evolution at the beginning is noticing that animals and plants and generally all organisms are really adapted to their environment. So they function specifically for uh, they're like designed for what they do. 1 second, I'm gonna check the two questions I have in the chat. Okay, continue. Okay, so of course, Darwin traveled all over the world collecting species and stuff, and you've probably heard of this before, but Darwin discovered he really made that uh, realization of evolution when he went to the Galapagos Islands, and he observed a lot of interesting things there. So Darwin's interest in geographic distribution of species was kindled by a stop at the Galapagos Islands, as I said. So when he went there, he saw adaptation to the environment. As I said before, that's a key thing that Darwin noticed and that really kickstarted his idea of evolution, seeing that species were adapted to their environment instead of being just loosely there. Like they had specific phenotypic part, or yeah, they had specific like body parts or things like that that were adapted to their environment, and they could function well there. Um, and Darwin saw specifically in the finches on the island, there were multiple different species, and they all had like different sized beaks, different sized bodies, or different sized feet, etc., that really helped where exactly on the islands they were. And biologists now can say that that's because of speciation. Yeah. So as you can see here, these finches, they look relatively similar, but they all have slightly different traits. For example, these two have, this one has like a bigger beak, then this is slightly smaller, and this is the smallest. And like for a seed, you need a strong and big beak to break it, but for an insect, you would not need that. So Darwin observed that the one that's eating the seed has a bigger beak, but the one that's eating insects has a smaller one. Um, So in 1844, Darwin wrote an essay on the origin of species and natural selection, but did not introduce his theory publicly. So for a long time, Darwin had realized this natural selection idea, but he waited a long time to say it because at the time it was really radical. No one thought that way, and it would be crazy for him to say that. He thought it would be crazy, but as he progressed, as he saw more and more and more things that supported his idea, he eventually published it in 1859. So the year before he published it, another scientist reached out to him who had a similar idea to Darwin. So they collaborated and published it. But Darwin is widely credited. He's the one who originally observed it, but he's also the one who published The Origin of Species. So the two main ideas of Darwin are descent with modification, which is really just evolution, and that explains unity and diversity. And natural selection is a major mechanism of of evolution, and is really the cause of adaptive evolution. Okay, so this is a diagram of, yeah, you can call this like a phylogenetic tree or cladogram. I guess they're different, but they're very similar in idea. So you start with this core species, and this evolves over time. And as you can see from Dinotherium all the way down to, I guess, the African elephant, I would assume, they all have like the trunk and stuff like that. They have the tusks. They're all different, but they have these specific types, and they originated from this point. And then before that, you have these species, and then there, but these are all from this one original ancestral species. Darwin noted that humans have modified other species by selecting and breeding individuals with desired traits. So this is artificial selection. You select for certain traits and you breed those certain traits, and you end up with those certain traits being more prominent. Um, there's a lot of examples of this. Many examples when you're talking about plants, when you're talking about crops that we eat. If you look at wild corn, even just corn 10, 20,000 years ago, it's unrecognizable compared to today. Even like bananas or watermelons, they all apply there. And even like, I guess, maybe not the greatest example, but also like dogs, you have a wide variety of those. So a major observation that helped Darwin put evolution together was that members of a population often vary greatly in their traits. So you'll have different like levels of traits within a population that can be selected for. The other observations, traits are inherited from parent to offspring, which means you have a genetic connection. All species are capable of producing more offspring than the environment can support, which means that some species will be selected for and others will die. Overproduction leads to competition for food and other resources. Again, when you have more than the environment can support, some will die and some will survive. And in the end, the individuals best adapted to their environment will survive and produce. So from this, Darwin took away two things. Individuals whose inherited traits give them a higher probability of surviving and reproducing in a given environment tend to leave more offspring than other individuals. So for example, if you're an insect and it's more beneficial for you to have black colored wings than white colored wings. The darker your wings are, the more likely you are to survive. So if a parent is giving birth to a lot of dark gray or insects that have a lot of dark gray wings, but another parent is giving birth to a lot of insects that have light gray wings, the parent that gives birth to dark gray wings will have more offspring survive. And then inference two is that the unequal ability of individuals to survive and reproduce will lead to the accumulation of favorable traits in the population over generations. So over time, if the environment doesn't change and black wings are preferred, then you'll gradually get to almost all black wings in the population. Um, Darwin was influenced by Thomas Malthus, who noted potential for human population to increase faster than food supplies. So again, this is kind of saying that you have a population that's exceeding the limit in the environment, so some will be selected for and some will die. And if some heritable traits are advantageous to accumulate, as we said before, and this explains really a lot of why organisms are adapted, because they gradually accumulate this trait that helps them to adapt to the environment, because that trait helps them survive. So survival of the fittest, it's a phrase you've probably heard a lot. It's thrown around a lot. I mean, I don't think it's the greatest phrase, but it can be used to explain some of, or it's like a very general term for like evolution, and individuals with certain heritable adaptive characteristics survive and reproduce at higher rates than others. Natural selection and mechanism increases the adaptation of organisms to the environment over time, and speciation. If an environment changes over time, natural selection may result in adaptation to these new conditions and may give rise to new species. So speciation is something we'll cover more in depth a little later. Um, predation and how this factors into natural selection. John Endler studied this with guppies. Um, so yeah, this is like an experiment that tested how these traits are preferred when you have predators. So in this situation, you have predators who have an easier time seeing brightly colored guppies. So the brightly colored guppies, when put in with predators, are more likely to die because the predators are able to see them easier and kill them easier. So when you put the brightly colored guppies into a pool with many predators, the population became less bright because because that's the trait that helped them survive. So now you have these less bright guppies, drab colored guppies, in a pool with many predators. Now you put them into a pool with very few predators, and the tendency for them is brightly colored helps them when there's no predators, so they gradually became brightly colored. This is really important for stuff like HIV, which evolves very, very quickly. It has many, many mutations very, very quickly, so it's very hard to combat. So this really just explains the use of a drug and how it tried to do something with to fight HIV. Um, but HIV developed a mutation that helps it fight this drug and makes the drug ineffective. And then gradually, when this drug is used, the HIV that has that mutation that helps it fight the drug becomes present in the population. So again, the ability of bacteria and viruses to evolve opposes a large challenge for society. Take for example, like superbugs, as they are called, bacteria that have developed resistance to almost all forms of antibiotics because of evolution and mutation. So they, you start with just like maybe very few bacteria have this mutation, and then once you use this antibiotics, those are the ones that survive, those are the ones that reproduce, and then eventually that spreads to the whole population. Natural selection doesn't create new traits. It selects for traits already present in the population. And the local environment determines which traits are beneficial and what traits will be selected for. Let me take a minute to look at the Someone said that phages can kill superbugs. I'm guessing you might be referring to the Kurzgesagt video. That was a good video. But yeah, that's definitely something that we can maybe look forward to. Hopefully, scientists can do something with that. Okay. Fossil evidence. So supporting evolution with evidence. So Darwin developed this idea originally in the early 1800s, but he didn't want to come out with it until he felt incredibly 100% confident. He knew that what he was saying was almost like 100% true, and he could support it with a lot of evidence. So fossils are one of these evidences. This picture isn't very clear, but you can see the gradual change of a trait over time. So you can they relatively date these fossils compared to each other, and then they can see the change of this trait. So this is essentially like whales. So you start with just a terrestrial mammal, and then it gradually the limbs get smaller and become more like fins, and so on and so on, and eventually you get a whale. And this develops over the course of millions and millions of years. This is geologically, it's not an incredibly long process, but for us looking at it, it's very, very long. Okay, so homology is similar, resulting from common ancestry. The root homo means the same. Um, Homologous structures are anatomical resemblances that represent variations on a structural theme present in a common ancestor, and I'll get into what exactly that means. So if you look at these are all mammals. Um, they all have similar, or they all have these same bones are present in all of them, except like the shape varies widely. So for example, if we're looking at the phalanges, which is this here, um, you can see that for me it looks like this, but if you look at a bat, it looks nothing like that. But it's still the same bones and it's still the same relative structure, because we're all like related from very, very long ago in common ancestor. So we all have these bones. Embryology is another way to show how all species are really related. So if you look at a chicken embryo versus a human embryo, at an early stage, they actually look incredibly similar. They have some traits that like just don't develop into fruition later on, and those are just because they were originally there from a common ancestor. Um, so these you can see like the very similar embryos and how they have similar characteristics and similar parts, and that just shows how we're all like um, generally related. Like for example, humans and embryos have a tail, and that never goes to fruition, but in common ancestor we had a tail tens, hundreds of millions of years ago. Okay, but vestigial structures are even more representative of that. They're remnants of features that served important functions in ancestors. So an example of this in the humans is an appendix. We don't need an appendix, it doesn't really help us, but we still have one because a common ancestor we had had an appendix and needed to use it. So that hasn't fully gone away in humans yet. Okay, so an evolutionary tree can kind of explain these homologies. So evolutionary trees they're really just hypotheses about what we think the relations between organisms are, what we think how far or like what we think their common ancestor is when they had this common ancestor, etc., etc. They can be used. They can be made using different types of data. For example, DNA sequence is probably one of the better ways to make evolutionary tree. You can see the amount of genetic differences over time and between between species. So the evolutionary tree or like phylogenetic tree, cladogram, they're all like the same idea. I guess cladograms, whatever. So you have this common ancestor, and each of these branch points is a common ancestor, but this original first branch point is a common ancestor for every single species listed here. The second common ancestor is a common ancestor for every single species except the first species, and so on. So everything that falls under its branch is a common ancestor for. And at each of these points, essentially you develop a new trait that is very different. Okay, convergent evolution it's just another kind of way of seeing um, evolution work, and it's essentially you have two different species that develop a very similar trait, um, and analogous traits, or you can call them, different groups independently adapt to similar environments in similar ways. So, say you're in the high treetops, um, or I guess that's not applicable, but a good example of this is birds and bats. They both ended up being able to fly. They both basically have wings, but birds are birds and bats are mammals. They're completely different species, but they face similar circumstances and they got to that position. This is just two squirrels in very different areas that developed similar things. Biogeography, or the geographic distribution of species, formed an important part in evolution. So islands have a lot of endemic species because they're so isolated. They're not found anywhere else. So Darwin postulated that endemic species are often closely related to species on the nearest mainland or island. Um, and this helped him with finches on the Galapagos. So important thing to know is Pangea, 200, I believe it's 265 million years ago, or around that time. All the continents were essentially put together, and you can make inferences through this. For example, if you find fossils off the coast of South America and Africa that are very similar and were present 300 million years ago, you can tell that, oh, they're probably connected and they were living together during this time. Understanding of continent movement helps us find where different species, when and where different species evolved. Um, Individuals in a population, or I guess these are the observations and then inferences and final like points that you get from what Darwin has done. Um, Mutation resistance. This is something that is more like AP Biology FRQ would ask you this when you have to analyze it. But you can see over time, month 0 to month 8 to month 12, it's just the percentage of resistance is increasing. Um, so this is the end of chapter 22. After this, we will move to chapter 23. So these are things you should know how to do. For the AP test, some of these, evolution really isn't asked on too much. There's some specific terms you should need to know if you're taking the AP test. But it forms a really good basis for critical thinking in biology, and generally just knowing what to do, how to logically think about things in biology. Okay. Um, I think the meeting has 6 minutes left. Um, we'll have to restart it anyway. Anmol, do you just want to restart it now? Just stop the meeting and start it again. I'll answer. I think there might be a question or two in the chat, but after that. Um, so what's the difference between evolution and convergent evolution? So convergent evolution is just an example of evolution working. So evolution is the core idea around everything. Convergent evolution just happens because of evolution and what it does. So evolution will apply to every single organism and in their environment. So convergent evolution is just when evolution causes the same thing to happen in different areas. Yeah, so if you just want to, you can just end the meeting and then we can rejoin afterwards, or do I have to do that? I think I have to actually. Okay. So I'm gonna end the meeting. You guys can rejoin in just a little bit. I don't know if Anmol, if you can hear me. You have to do the same host thing again. All right. We can get started. Now with chapter 23. Okay. So chapter 23, we're just talking about evolution more. We'll get into it. Okay, so natural selection, incredibly important. So natural selection acts on individuals. Oh, but the population as a whole evolves. So important thing to know is an individual doesn't really evolve, it's just a population over time. Genetic variations in populations contribute to evolution. Really the core idea of genetics and everything that happens there, meiosis, crossing over, fertilization, everything like that is what allows evolution to happen. And all the genetic stuff will be covered much later on. Microevolution is a change in allele frequencies in a population over generations. So it's really evolution on a smaller scale. So two processes, mutation and sexual variation or sexual reproduction, produce the variation in gene pools that contributes to differences among individuals. Um, so for example, sexual reproduction, the way it works, meiosis, you'll get into that later, essentially produces a lot of different possibilities. It's has a lot of randomness in it. So there's a lot of possibilities. There's a lot of different traits you could end up with after meiosis. So that's why there's a large variety of traits, at least in organisms that reproduce sexually. And mutation, that applies for every single organism. Something can go wrong, and most of the times that hurts the organism, but sometimes that can help, and the mutation can be distributed throughout the population and passed down. Um, Population geneticists measure polymorphisms, whatever. Okay, average heterozygosity measures the average percent of loci that are heterozygous in a population. You can use this to tell a lot. It's useful when you're looking at Hardy-Weinberg. Most species exhibit geographic variation, so difference between gene pools of separate populations or population subgroups. So for example, you have like a same species, but it's spread over a very large area. So if the areas are different, then the populations in one area will have maybe slightly different gene pools than populations in another area. Geographic variation occurring over time or over an area, like I guess you can like graph the geographic variation. When you do that, it's called a cline. So for example, you take a mountain. So when you go higher up the mountain, it's harder to breathe because you really have like less oxygen there. Um, so you might like over time as you go up the mountain, the genes that help you, I guess that there's not like genes that like specifically help you breathe, but maybe you have like traits that help you breathe, maybe increase like your body parts, functions, stuff like that may increase as you go up the mountain. So this is an example of a cline. So as it gets warmer, the frequency of this allele decreases because this allele helps the fish the most in the colder waters. Mutations are changes in the nucleotide sequence of DNA. Mutations are incredibly important. They can cause new genes and alleles to arise. And in most cases, these are negative, but in very few cases, these can be positive and help the organization or organism. Only mutations in cells that produce gametes can be passed to offspring. This is also really important. If a mutation happens inside your body, so you get a mutation in your skin cell, you get, take for example, skin cancer. You get a mutation in your skin cell, and then you end up getting skin cancer. But skin cancer wouldn't be passed down if you had offspring, as long as it is contained in the area, not passed to the gametes. But if you had a genetic disorder that affected every single cell, including your gametes, then that would be in your gametes and you would pass it down. A point mutation is a change in one base in a gene. So that's like, we'll get into DNA a little bit more when we get into basic chemistry and stuff. But let's just say you had a DNA sequence that's hundreds of thousands of nucleotides long. A point mutation means that a single one of those nucleotides is just changed to something else. Point mutations can have a lot of effects. So if it's in non-coding regions, we'll get into this in genetics. These are called introns. They essentially have no effect because introns don't really code for anything. They also might not affect the protein at all. For example, a lot of point mutations in the third sequence of a codon won't affect the end protein because the first two ones are really what decides the amino acid. Not in all cases, or not even in like most cases, but that's like a possibility. And even if like you still end up with something a hydrophobic or hydrophilic amino acid, the structure won't change that much. When it changes in the protein structure, in the vast majority of cases, it is harmful, but there sometimes in rare cases it can help. Chromosomal mutations are mutations that delete or disrupt or rearrange many loci and are typically very harmful. For example, Down syndrome is caused by a chromosomal abnormality. Mutation rates are low in animal and plants. Mutation rates are often lower in prokaryotes and higher in viruses, which helps viruses adapt more, or not more, but faster usually. Sexual reproduction can shuffle existing alleles into new combinations. So sexual reproduction just leads to a lot of different varieties, a lot of different ways to organize the genetic code. This is something that will be explored more when we cover meiosis. In organisms that reproduce sexually, recombination of alleles is more important than mutation in producing genetic differences that make adaptation possible. So as we said before, the two main mechanisms of natural selection are sexual reproduction for animals that reproduce that way, and mutations. So in prokaryotes that don't reproduce sexually, they reproduce asexually. Mutations are really the only cause of natural selection within them, because that's the only way they're going to have more variation. But also the reason that they're still able to evolve relatively quickly and not incredibly slowly because they don't have sexual variation is because the mutation rates, they reproduce very quickly, so the mutation rates are sufficient for them to evolve. For us, our mutation rates are incredibly low because we reproduce not like very often, and that might not be the best way to phrase it, but we need sexual variation. It's worth it for us to invest energy into that to create new combinations. Hardy-Weinberg. So this is something in class when I took AP biology. We spent like 1-2 weeks covering it, cover the equations, memorizing all the reasons. When I got to the AP test, it wasn't really that relevant. It wasn't too important at all. But this is something good to know. Something relatively cool to think about, that you can figure out if a population is evolving or not. So a population, the definition of it is a localized group of individuals capable of interbreeding and producing fertile offspring. A gene pool consists of all alleles for all loci in a population. So for example, if there are 3 alleles for petal color, you had an allele that made it white, red, and pink. Those are the gene pool, or those are the alleles. A locus is fixed if all individuals in a population are homozygous for the same allele, which just means they all have the exact same allele for everything. Or the same allele for that trait, sorry, not everything. The frequency of an allele in a population can be calculated. So this is where the Hardy-Weinberg equations come into play. So if there are 2 alleles at a locus, so both of them, of course, add up to all the alleles. So in probability, everything is just 1. So you can say that the 2 alleles P and Q add up to 1. And then if you just square both sides of that equation, so P plus Q whole squared, that just leads you to P squared plus 2PQ equals Q squared. And what each of these represent is P squared is homozygous, Q squared is homozygous, and PQ is heterozygous. You have both P and Q. So if you have some of these values, you can solve for the others. So take for example, if you had the value of P squared and Q squared, or I guess I can't give an example off the top of my head, but you can end up solving for all the components of this. So the 5 conditions that satisfy Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, which essentially means that a population is not evolving. It means no mutations, or mutations are very insignificant, random mating, So there's no like selective mating. No natural selection. Of course, natural selection is a mechanism of evolution. An extremely large population, because in a small population, you can't really have anything consistent, and no gene flow. You don't want genes coming in and out. Um, so take for example, this is a trait that has been analyzed for Hardy-Weinberg. So the mutation rate's very low. The selection is random, as in like they don't care about if they do not have this allele. Natural selection is very, very rare, and the population is large, and um, migration isn't really present or doesn't have an effect on this allele. So this allele would likely be in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So take for example, if you wanted to see, is the trait of, I guess there's a lot of probably multiple genes that code for your height, but let's just say you're focusing on one gene that maybe affected your height. Is that gene evolving in our population? So you can just look at these things. Do people care about height when they're looking for a mate? If the answer is yes, then you have one of those conditions not satisfied, which means the population is not in equilibrium and therefore it is evolving. So I think I remember my teacher talking about people doing that in like Sweden or something, and they found that females preferred taller guys. So that was evolving very slowly, but it was evolving. So you can do population or calculations. So the occurrence of PKU is 1 in per 100,000, 10,000 birds. So PKU is only present when you have both recessive alleles. This is something that you probably cover in very basic biology, or maybe even like middle school biology. When you cover that, it's just dominant and recessive alleles. So you need 2 recessive alleles for PKU. So that means Q squared. Q is usually denoted for the recessive allele. Of course, you can have like other types. It doesn't have to be always dominant recessive, but Q is usually the recessive allele. So Q squared, having both recessive alleles, is this rate, and then you square root that, you get 0.01 for Q itself, and then now you have P plus Q equals 1. You know Q and you know 1, so you can solve for P, which is 0.99. And then the frequency of heterozygotes is 2PQ, which is 2 times 0.99 times 0.01, which is 0.0198, which is approximately 2%. So it's very rare to get a problem like that on the AP test, but you might. So 3 major factors that alter allele frequencies are and bring about most evolutionary change: natural selection, genetic drift, and gene flow. So these are defined as natural selection is differential success in reproduction. It results in certain alleles being passed to the next generation in greater proportions by the more fit individuals. So essentially, those traits that are better will be selected for more. Genetic drift describes how allele frequencies fluctuate randomly from one generation to the next. In a smaller sample, the greater the chance of deviation from a predicted result. Genetic drift tends to reduce genetic variation through losses of alleles. So essentially, say you have a large population and you have like a relatively rare trait. So this is a very hypothetical example. I think it's happened in real life with some traits, and it does happen with organisms. But in humans, it's very rare to see this. I think it's happened a few times in the past. But essentially, you get of that population, you have a sub like group of people, and they're taken away. And in that group of people, you have a higher rate of that allele. So that allele is significantly more common in that population, um, or they just don't have that allele. So that's just gone, and you have less genetic variation. Yeah. So it's like you have all of these, and then you just like kind of only, yeah, you just only take like the red ones. The founder effect. Oh wait, sorry, this was what I was talking about when I was saying that earlier. This is like part of genetic drift. What I was saying earlier isn't like genetic drift as a whole. It's just this was a specific scenario. The founder effect is when you have a few individuals that get isolated from a larger population, and the allele frequencies are very different than the original population. The bottleneck effect is a sudden reduction in population size due to a change in the environment, such as natural disaster. So we can talk about humans in this. So let's just say throughout humanity, the history of humanity, there's been a lot of, let's say, volcanic eruptions that have caused a lot of the human population to die. So you only have a very limited amount of people left. So usually when that happens, the resulting gene pool becomes not reflective of the original population gene pool, and it can be further affected by genetic drift and often becomes more homogeneous and more similar because of that. Yeah, so you only get, so let's just say, yeah, like take for example, you have these three traits. It looks like the white and blue are about equal, and the yellow is just not very like rare. So now when you have the bottleneck effect, you have very few population remaining. Only that yellow is just not there anymore. So you don't have that trait because that wasn't selected for. And the blue now becomes much more common than the yellow just because of random chance of who was selected. Effects of genetic drift, significant in small population, causes allele frequencies to change at random, can lead to a loss of genetic variation within populations, can cause harmful alleles to become fixed. So again, being fixed means that every single organism has that allele. Gene flow consists of the movement of alleles among populations. Alleles can be transferred through movement of fertile individuals or gametes. Yeah, pollen's a good example. So the plants reproduce, they produce pollen, and those pollen is carried by the wind to very far away areas, and then you get that those genes into a different plant that might be very far away. Gene flow tends to reduce differences between populations over time because essentially different populations mixing, so they kind of share their traits. It's more likely the mutation to alter allele frequencies directly. Mutations are pretty rare. Okay, natural selection mechanism. Only natural selection consistently results in adaptive evolution. So the other stuff is kind of reliant on just generally how genes are in a population previously, but natural selection is truly like what causes the change, what like you're selecting for. Natural selection brings about adaptive evolution by acting on organisms' phenotype. So phenotype is typically coded by the genotype is coded by the genotype. So you're selecting by phenotype. This doesn't always correspond to genotype. Actually, in most of the cases, it does not. For example, a heterozygous individual in a dominant recessive allele type will look like the dominant individual, but they'll still be a carrier for the recessive allele. It's acting on the phenotypes. So if you have the dominant trait or the recessive traits acting on those, and then genotype comes subsequently. So again, if you didn't know, phenotype is just like the physical trait. Okay, I'll look at the chat for. Okay, multiple questions. Okay, so non-coding, we'll cover this later, but essentially means that when you're going through essential dogma, when you're coding for traits and coding for proteins, those essentially just aren't accounted for. We call those introns. Those are just a part of the DNA that just isn't accounted for. It's cut out of the mRNA and it's not coded. Why are mutations lower in plants and such? We just reproduce slower, so it's worth it for us to invest in sexual reproduction. Why you square the Hardy-Weinberg equation? So you do that because when you square it, you get different terms. You get p squared, 2pq, and q squared. And those terms, you can find those terms in the population. You can use those to solve for the general terms. And 2pq is just the heterozygous because just take p as this dominant real, q as the recessive allele. So someone who's heterozygous will have both of those. So that's why both P and Q are represented in that term. Okay. Class is almost over. We'll see what I can cover before class ends. Actually, how much do we have left? Okay. There's around 10 slides left. I don't think we'll finish it today. Yeah, I don't think we'll finish this today, but can pick off a lot of the stuff at the end isn't too important. So we can just continue with chapter 24 next week. I'll just cover one or two more slides and then class will end. So the phrase survival for the fittest is misleading because it kind of implies direct competition, but it's generally natural mechanism. Natural selection is a general mechanism, acts on everything. It doesn't have to be just because of competition, and even competition, you're competing for resources, typically. Reproductive success is generally more subtle and depends on a lot of factors. Relative fitness is the contribution an individual makes to the gene pool of the next generation. So fitness is kind of just a way that we try to measure how useful those traits that they have are. So a good way to look at this, when I was taking normal biology, they did a lot of simulations, virtual simulations, and it's like, say you're on a green leaf, the more green you are, the harder for it is for a bird to see you and eat you. So you want to become more green. So an individual that's more green will have a higher fitness because their alleles help them survive more. Three modes of natural selection: directional selection, disruptive selection, stabilizing selection. Okay, this is kind of important to know if you want to take the AP biology test. So this essentially means you can kind of use logic to figure this out, but there's three things that can do. So either you have two different traits. So you have either one trait is better, you go towards there. So that green trait on the green leaf is better, you go towards that. Disruptive selection, you have two traits. Let's just say you have two different traits. Both of them help you. So you end up with like a split, and it favors people either having both alleles of one thing. So being homozygous. And stabilizing selection favors the middle. The ends are worse than having both. So these are the three different graphs. You start with this as the original. So disruptive, you just move more towards one side, or directional, sorry. Disruptive, you move to both sides, and stabilizing, move to the middle. And I think today, it's 8:30 now, so we can end class for today. Again, if you guys have not seen, I can put it in the chat again, but make sure you look at the notes if you want to review what we learned today, or you can look at the PowerPoints. Those are also on the syllabus. And if you really want to prepare for the AP Biology exam, which I would recommend you to do, I would look at the vocab terms as well. Okay. Sorry, I have to fix that. You are correct. Some of the links on the Google Doc do not give access yet. The notes itself might not be accessible yet. Those are originally made. I made them to help some of my classmates when I was taking the class. So it's it's for some reason only people from my school can access it. I will get on that. Sorry about that. I'll change that right after class ends. All right. Thank you guys. That's it for today. We'll see you next week.